Everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. I'm sure most of us would rather be in the hall than back in Zoom, but needs must. We're very lucky this morning. We've got Colin Sellars, one of our members, speaking to us, and as he checked his screen earlier, we got a little taste of what's to come, so it looks really interesting. So I'll pass you over to Colin, who's going to talk to us on impressions of China. We'll take questions at the end because I think that will be easier, but do feel free to type in any questions in the chat function as we go along, if that's helpful. Okay, Colin, over to you.
Okay, thanks. Between 2008 and 2018, my wife and I worked at the French school in Singapore, the Lycée Français. French school holidays are quite generous, and Singapore is very much a transport hub. So there was ample opportunity for us to travel widely all over Asia. At first, however, we were a bit hesitant about China, mainly because of the oppression the Tibetans had suffered at the hands of the Chinese state since Tibet was annexed by China in the early 1950s. But at the same time, we were fascinated by the contrasts between the ancient culture, the violent upheaval of the Cultural Revolution, and the frenetic pace of recent economic development. So in 2012, we decided to make our first visit. Okay, so hopefully you can see this map here. Hang on. Oh, sorry, that's okay. Okay, can you see the map? Okay.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Great.
So,
that's great.
In 2012, we decided to make our first visit. And it turned out, in fact, to be the first of 6 that we made between then and 2018, when we retired and came back to Scotland. And for our first trip, we didn't want to take any risks. So we chose the province of Guangxi, which I think you can see there at the bottom, in southwest China. In particular, a region famous for its cone-shaped karst mountains, which are featured on the 20 yuan banknote. So here you can see these cone-shaped mountains. Karst, in fact, is a form of chalk or limestone, which is quite soft. So over the centuries, the rain has caused the stone to dissolve, leaving the peculiar features that we can see today. We spent several days going for walks and bicycle rides in the surrounding area. Here's another photo where you see the mountains and the river Yi. Although the region is very beautiful and there were many Chinese tourists, there were very few foreigners, which we found to be the case all over China. Okay, so when the Chinese write signs or notices in English, the results can be quite amusing. This one says, this is a poster that I took a photograph of. It says, the middle reaches of the tourist board of your painting. Now, what on earth that means, I'm not sure, but I think that it's an advertisement for day trips in the region. But sometimes the English can be very odd indeed. Okay. Oh. Hang on a second, I'm just running out of power on the computer now. There we go. Okay. In southwest China, it's not well known, but in southwest China, there are hill tribe communities very similar to those which live in the north of Burma, Myanmar as it's called now, the north of Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. They grow rice in paddy fields cut in terraces into the mountain slopes. So this photograph was taken in that same region where we visited the hill tribes in the village that you can see in the middle of the photo there. Okay. one thing that is very striking in China is the contrast between the kind of relentless modernity of the cities and the very simple, basic life of some of the people who live in the countryside. You can see this lady with her basket and her stick and the house behind. I don't think you could find any equivalent of that in the Western world, any contrast so striking between the urban life and rural life in the Western world at all. For our second journey, we chose the province of Yunnan, which is here, it's the extreme southwest province of China. We landed in the capital here, Kunming, and in our hotel, after that, we went northwards towards a small town called Shaxi, which is there, which is a very well-preserved ancient town. And then we moved further north towards the north of Yunnan, which is already kind of Tibetan territory, even though it's technically in Yunnan. In our hotel room in Kunming, we found another nice example of what might be called Chinglish, carefully slippery. We weren't quite sure what was meant by that. But the best one, the most intriguing and the most surreal of all is this one, Secular Bird Station. This was the sign above a clothes shop in Kunming. So what on earth they were trying to say by Secular Bird Station, I've no idea. So from Kunming, we moved north towards the north of Yunnan, and we stopped in this beautifully preserved old town called Shaxi. It's so well preserved that it's often used for filming historical dramas. This slide shows the main square in Shaxi. And here is a detail from that photograph. And I think it's interesting to see the contrast again between the two young Chinese, probably visitors up from Kunming, and the older man on the left, who looks like something, a relic from the Maoist era. But the contrast again is quite striking. While we were going for a walk through the town, I noticed this grandfather who was keeping a close eye on his granddaughter in the yard of their house. The next day, we went cycling in the area, and we met this group of women who were in fact rehearsing songs. This lady here was clearly the leader of the group. They were friendly, welcoming, and happy to be photographed, which was our experience throughout China. We never experienced any unpleasantness at all. I'll show you a few photographs now of the market in Shaxi, and you'll notice that quite a lot of the people are clearly from hill tribes. They're not kind of Han Chinese, they're clearly from hill tribes. So this is the fruit and vegetable section. These women were loading the boxes onto the lorries. This is a restaurant where they stopped for lunch. I think that's incense that they're selling, but I'm not sure. So here you can tell from the clothes, these are typical clothes of the hill tribes, very colourful. Again, this lady also is clearly from the hill tribes. You can also tell from her features that she comes from the hill tribes. And I think I really like this lady with her magnificent headdress and her pipe. So you know, she's selling something in the market, but she's clearly not ordinary Chinese. She's from one of the hill tribe groups. From Shaxi, we continued on to the north of Yunnan, where most of the people are Tibetan. In fact, what the Chinese did after they annexed Tibet was to redraw the borders of several provinces in order to make Tibet smaller and incorporate certain bits into sort of China proper, if you like. We stayed in a town called Shangri-La. It had that strange name because the mayor had changed the name a few years previously to try to attract more tourists. The owner of the guest house where we were staying organized a walk for us, which allowed us to visit a Tibetan farmhouse. And here you can see the exterior of the farmhouse. Here's a detail of the typically Tibetan decoration, very beautiful, very, very intricate Tibetan decoration on the front of the farmhouse, which we just saw. Here we see the farmer's wife in her kitchen. She gave us a cup of Tibetan tea, which was made with yak milk and yak butter. I think it would be fair to say that it's probably an acquired taste. Here we see her again in her kitchen. You can see the kettle in the bottom right-hand corner there. So that was a very interesting experience to be able to actually see inside the farmhouse. The manager of the guest house came with us, so we were able to talk to the lady and get an insight into her life. There was a primary school had just opened actually in the village, and of course the teaching was all in Mandarin. So you wonder how long the Tibetan culture in that particular village on the sort of the periphery of the Tibetan world, if you like, can survive, because in a generation, in say 20 years or something, when these kids finish school, Mandarin they'll see Mandarin as the language of opportunity and education and work, and Tibetan will have become probably a bit kind of the language of the grandparents, something a bit kind of connected with folklore. But we'll see. Tibetan culture has actually been very resilient up till now. In Shangri-La, there was also quite a large Tibetan monastery. So this is the outside of it, with very typical kind of Tibetan architecture, bit kind of higgledy-piggledy, everything on top of each other, but very, very beautiful Tibetan architecture. For our third trip, we chose the province of Fujian, down here in southeast China. Here we landed in the port city of Xiamen here, and we spent a couple of days there at the beginning, but the main point was to go up here more into the center of Fujian province to visit these fortified villages called tulos. They were built as protection against gangs of marauding bandits, which were quite common in this part of China till the 19th century. So they're very much sort of fortified villages. There you can see the outside, and here we have the inside. So you've got the rooms, the rooms here round the courtyard, and sometimes buildings in the middle of the courtyard, sometimes not. Each family has a kitchen on the ground floor, which you can see here. Here we see some of the women preparing the vegetables, sitting along outside their kitchens and preparing the vegetables for the evening meal. And each family also has a couple of other rooms on the upper floors of the tulo. Most of them are still inhabited, but a few, like this one, have become tourist attractions. They're no longer inhabited, they've become tourist attractions. But most of them are still inhabited. Most of them are round, like the one we saw. A few square ones, but most of them are round. You need a few days to visit the tulos because they're spread over quite a wide area. So we had to find a hotel, and we were quite fortunate to find this one in one of the villages. I think it was very picturesque and very atmospheric, but rather basic. This is the outside. Here's the inside. So as I say, it was a beautiful place, very, very atmospheric, but it's a bit basic, and its rustic charm ran to chamber pots for the night, because the corridors weren't very well lit and the toilets were quite far away. But it was well worth it to stay in such a beautiful and atmospheric place. Here is the entrance to the hotel, which I like this one because to me it sums up a lot of rural China colors, and sitting at the front and everything kind of sums up rural China for me. As I said, we landed in Xiamen, in the port city Xiamen, at the beginning of our holiday, and we spent a couple of days on a small island there, just about 10 minutes by ferry from the coast. It's a popular place for the locals to go for the weekend, for example, because there are no cars. But they also go there to this little island off the coast to take wedding photos, sometimes weeks or even months before the ceremony itself. And there were groups of them taking these wedding photos when we were on the island, and we were intrigued by their choice of clothes that they wore for these wedding photographs. For example, these two, I was very taken with these two. They clearly think they're the bee's knees, but you wonder what kind of image they're trying to create. And this is a bit typical of China, because the upheaval of the Cultural Revolution was such that you have the impression of despite their ancient culture, in many ways of a country that's kind of started again from zero. And the results of that can be very odd at times. Here's another couple. And again, you wonder what they think they're doing. I mean, it's all very Gone with the Wind, and they look fantastic, but you wonder what's in their minds when they take these wedding photos. Okay, so on our fourth trip to China, our goal was to see the three great classics of Chinese tourism: the Great Wall, the Forbidden City, which was, of course, the home of the emperors until the 1920s, and the Terracotta Warriors in Xi'an. So we landed in Beijing, here in Beijing, where we saw the Great Wall and the Forbidden City. And then we took the fast train, which is the kind of Chinese equivalent of the French TGV. We took the fast train down here in Xi'an, more in the center of China. It's a distance of approximately 750 miles, and it takes about 5 hours to cover that distance in the fast train. So that was our fourth trip to China, which was Beijing and Xi'an. On the way back, we stopped about here to do some sightseeing on the way back. So we took the fast train down and slow trains back up. Okay, so the Chinese are, without doubt, the world champions of kitsch. The day that we visited Tiananmen Square, there was this giant vase of artificial flowers. Never actually found out what it was for, but it looked pretty amazing. There's this huge vase of artificial flowers in the middle of Tiananmen Square, and it's obviously much nicer to see that than tanks and soldiers. In the background, you can see the entrance to the Forbidden City, home of the emperors until the empire collapsed in the 1920s. Here are a few photos from inside the Forbidden City. I think this one shows the scale of the place and the magnificent architecture. This is another one of the wide yards within the Forbidden City. Lots and lots of Chinese tourists, of course, because it's a kind of place of well, pilgrimage, I suppose, an important part of their history. And here we have a door, a very intricate door from inside the Forbidden City. Of course, you can't visit that part of China without going to see the Great Wall. And the Great Wall doesn't disappoint. It's as extraordinary as you would imagine it to be. We were actually rather lucky that day, because at the bus station, when we were looking for a bus to go and visit the Great Wall, we bumped into a French woman who worked at the Alliance Française in Beijing. And she was taking a couple of people who were visiting her out to see the Great Wall, and she knew where to go. She knew what bus to get in order to go out into a place where there wouldn't be hordes of tourists. So we were very lucky, as you can see from the photo. There were no tourists that day. But the Great Wall doesn't disappoint. It's just every bit as amazing as you imagine. Okay, then we got the fast train down to Xi'an. Now, Xi'an was the starting point of the Silk Road. So for hundreds of years, it was a very prosperous and cosmopolitan city until the decline of the Silk Road in the 18th century. Even today, there are 10 kilometers of ramparts around the city centre. And here is a photo of part of those ramparts. Obviously a nice place for the locals to walk and cycle. Because it was the start of the Silk Road, it attracted merchants from Central Asia. So somewhat surprisingly, in the middle of China, there's actually a Muslim community in a Muslim district. This photograph is actually a mosque. You'll notice the Arabic writing on the pillars on either side of the door. That's quite interesting to see this peculiar mixture of Chinese styles and Muslim styles. Here we have a street scene from Xi'an, and in this photograph we can see the baskets in which they steam their famous dim sum dumplings, which are a delicious treat, or you can have them for lunch. Now, I chose this one because it's very typical of a modern Chinese cityscape, if you like. Very wide streets, 10 lanes of traffic, 5 on either side for the cars and buses. And the street is lined by these buildings, which are very functional, but personally, I find them a bit sort of cold and intimidating. But that is typical of a busy street in a modern Chinese city, which doesn't mean, of course, that they don't know how to show off their ancient monuments as well. This is also from Xi'an and taken at night to an old temple. The main reason, of course, for visiting Xi'an is to see the excavation of the famous Terracotta Warriors. So you can see thousands of them, which I think a farmer accidentally stumbled on in the 1970s, and since then they've all been excavated. Here's a closer view, and they were buried with the statues were made with statues of horses as well. This was all about getting on for 2,000 years ago, when they accompanied one of the early emperors into the afterlife. So he would be well protected in the afterlife. Apparently, when they were first buried with the emperor, they looked like this. They were painted like this one. But obviously over the centuries, the paint has faded. But that's what they looked like when they were first buried with one of the first emperors a couple of thousand years ago. On the way back to Beijing, as I said, we stopped off to visit these caves, which have got statues of the Buddha dating back to about 1,500 years. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of the photograph, you'll see Marie Claude. I asked her to stand there so that you'd get a sense of the size of the Buddha statues. Very, very impressive. We also wanted to see this temple, which hangs from the side of a steep mountain. You can see these poles are the only thing that are keeping it up. So that's really quite an impressive sight as well. This temple hanging off the steep mountainside. On that stopover on the way back to Beijing, we stayed in this hotel, which is in fact the restored house of a rich 18th century merchant. And once again, it was a really beautifully atmospheric place to stay. It had been just restored just to the right amount, just so it seemed authentic, not Disneyfied at all, just authentic. It was really a great place. For our fifth trip to China, we chose the province of Sichuan and also the province of Jiangsu. So we started off in Chengdu, which is the capital of Sichuan province, one of the largest, if I remember correctly, the sixth largest city in China, with a population a little bit under 10 million people. From there, we moved north to the northern corner of Sichuan, which is once again very much Tibetan territory. And but after that, we went by bus and train up to the city of Dunhuang in Gansu province. So that was our fifth trip. It was quite a long one, actually. Chengdu up to the north and then to Dunhuang in Gansu province. Chengdu, as I say, is a very large city, about almost 10 million inhabitants, and it's very famous for its tea rooms. This one is next to a small lake in a park in the city centre. When you arrive, you buy a little packet of tea and you're given a cup and a thermos of boiling water. Then you can spend a pleasant afternoon chatting by the lake. Here's another view of the tea room. So you can spend the afternoon chatting as they do, or you can have your ears cleaned out. So you've got these guys offering their services with their headlamp and their implements, and they clean out your ears. Also, the lady in the photo doesn't seem to be terribly confident about the whole business. The fast food of Chengdu, we can see on this photograph here. It's quite large, sort of noodles, a bit like in the bit in the shape of chips you get from a Scottish fish and chip shop, and they're served with a thick, spicy sauce and spring onions. And here you can see them being prepared in a restaurant in Chengdu. It's quite delicious, but not always easy to eat. As you can see me struggling with them there. On the yes, in a park in Chengdu, we also found another nice example of Chinglish. There will be no striding in this park. Again, they get it a wee bit wrong, but the results can be quite amusing. Okay, on the outskirts of Chengdu, there is a giant panda reserve. Now, we're used to seeing them like this, apparently doing nothing apart from lolling about and relaxing all day, but we're not used to seeing them like this. So on the right side of the photo there is actually pretty much a newborn giant panda. On the left, this one has got its fur, but it's still very young because it's not walking yet. So it was possible to see these in this this panda reserve on the outskirts of Chengdu. About 50 kilometers south of Chengdu, there is the world's largest seated Buddha. And as you can see, it's a very popular outing for the inhabitants of Chengdu. But the Chinese are very good at organizing and filtering large groups of people, very large crowds. So it all goes slowly, but very smoothly. In the background, in contrast, you can see some of the rather grim tower blocks of the modern economic miracle. Okay, so after that, we made our way north, and on the way, we passed by the beautiful national park of Juizaigu, where there was this rather magnificent waterfall. Then we arrived in the north, very northern part of Sichuan province. Now, this is in fact part of the former Tibetan region of Kham, and it still feels very Tibetan. You can visit monasteries, and the pilgrims still come to pray and to turn the prayer wheels. You can go into the monasteries. You can observe the daily life of the monks and the pilgrims. This is another monastery, but built in a slightly different style. But that colour, of course, is very typical of Tibetan architecture. And the round, those kind of sorry, round circular shapes are also very typical. This is the inside of one of the monasteries. I love these places. There's a very sort of warm atmosphere, a spiritual warm atmosphere inside the temples, the monasteries. Here you can see a long line of prayer wheels. Excuse me. And the pilgrims come to turn these wheels. In the background, you can see a couple of pilgrims gradually making their progress along the prayer wheels. They come to turn them, and presumably by doing so to gain merit. Here's a group of monks, a kind of study group of young monks, presumably studying some religious text outside in the courtyard of one of the monasteries. You can see lots of prayer flags as well. Here is the apparently quite well-fed abbot of the monastery. As you can see from his hat, he belongs to the Yellow Hat school of Tibetan Buddhism. The pilgrims, this monastery where I took the photographs, apparently was one of the, I think, 5 most important in Tibetan Buddhism, which is why it attracted pilgrims. Here we see the monks. Now, the pilgrims were all extremely devout. You could see it was quite, it was a big thing for them to visit this monastery. Some of the monks appeared less so. And it was rumored actually that a few of the monks might have been planted there by the Chinese police, just to keep an eye on what was going on. Here we see some pilgrims arriving to visit the monastery. You can see that they're wearing Tibetan clothes. Here are some more. If you look at the women, these are very Tibetan faces. These women have got very, very typical Tibetan faces, not Chinese at all. And again, they're wearing their nice Tibetan clothes, and clearly very happy to be visiting the monastery. Okay, thanks to a small local travel agency, we were happy to visit and to stay overnight with Tibetan farmers in a village in the mountains. These were our hosts. Communication wasn't easy, but we were doing our best in the evening when they gave us dinner, when suddenly their house started to shake quite violently. And for a moment, nobody says anything because everyone's in a state of shock. Your brain can't really work out what's going on. And then one of them shouted something, which I presume meant earthquake in Tibetan, and we all rushed outside. And they were clearly very concerned about the possibility of an avalanche, because if a whole lot of rocks and boulders had come down the mountain, then we would have had it. But we didn't know. But in fact, the epicenter was about 100 miles away, near the waterfall actually, which I showed you before. So we were safe enough. But it was quite a frightening moment. Here again, we can see the how rudimentary life in the villages are compared to the city. On another outing in the north of Sichuan, we visited these Tibetan nomads. In the background, you can see their traditional black tent. Here we see inside the tent, and they might be Tibetan nomads, but this girl in the front there, the mobile phone was glued to her ear the whole time we were there. Here we see two of the ladies preparing the evening meal in the back of the tent. And here is one of their yaks. They're nomads because of their herds of yaks. This lady in the town sold delicious yak milk yogurt, which is what she's advertising there in the front of her stall. So it was a really, really delicious yogurt. Okay, so as I said, also I forgot about this one here. These are the lads from a Tibetan cafe. So I wasn't sure how they would react to a request to take a photograph of them, but they were quite happy about it. So these are the lads in the cafe in a Tibetan village. Okay, so as I said, from the north of Sichuan up here, we moved by bus and then train up here to approximately this point here to the city of Dunhuang. Now, Dunhuang was the last town in China before, and therefore for the Chinese, the last town in the civilized world, before the Silk Road ventured out into the wilds of Central Asia. So merchants who could afford it paid for the decoration of caves like this one and this one, where they would pray for safe passage before setting off on their perilous journey across Central Asia. Dunhuang, as well as being the last town in China in the Silk Road, is also at the edge of the Gobi Desert. So there are huge dunes. You can see from the people here the size of these dunes, and also large kind of rocks scattered over a wide area. You can see from the Jeep here the size of the rocks. So this very kind of arid kind of a moonscape of that part of the Gobi Desert has got these very large rock formations scattered all over them. This lady was in the night market in Dunhuang, and she was selling herbs and herbal tea in her stall in the night market in Dunhuang, up in the northwest of China. There were also some food stalls and some small outdoor restaurants in the night market, which sold some pretty exotic dishes, and this was probably the most exotic of them all. So for 12 yuan, you can sample lamb penis kebabs. I have to admit that I was a bit too squeamish. I was tempted, but in the end, I didn't. I was a bit too squeamish. Okay, so for our last journey to China, which was also the shortest, was in July 2018, when we'd actually finished working by that time. But we didn't want to leave Asia without seeing Shanghai and the Yellow Mountain. So I'll just go back there. Shanghai and the Yellow Mountain. So we flew to Shanghai and this visited the region, Shanghai, and the region around it. Okay, so one thing we really wanted to see was the Yellow Mountain, which you can see here. You know, the very sort of jagged peaks of the Yellow Mountain are what you see on a lot of classical Chinese paintings. We also visited, Shanghai is surrounded by a number of canal towns. And here is one of them that we visited. They're very peaceful, very picturesque in a very Chinese way, and very peaceful, of course, in comparison to the great metropolis nearby. I'll finish with a couple of photographs of Shanghai. So this is the financial district of Shanghai. taken from the Bund, looking across to the new financial district. And finally, this one is Shanghai by night. Obviously, I've fiddled a bit with the colours and the light, but I think it suits the kind of futuristic aspect of the city quite well. Shanghai, of course, is often referred to as the New York of the 21st century. From Shanghai, we got a train up to Beijing. And a couple of years previously, we'd spent a few weeks visiting Mongolia. So instead of joining the Trans-Siberian in Beijing, the Trans-Siberian Railway in Beijing, we got a flight from Beijing up to here to Irkutsk in Siberia, where we joined the Trans-Siberian, which was coming from Vladivostok. But of course, that is a different story. That's another story. Okay, well, thanks for listening. That's the end.
Colin, that was really fascinating. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk, and I loved all the maps as well. It really indicated where you've been, and yeah.
I thought it was important to know where it was. You know, it was important to know.
Totally.
Bits of
and
China
I think if you want a post-retirement job, you could do tours out to China. I'm sure we'd all be signing up. Now, I don't know if I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions. If people can maybe raise their hand or use the signal, and I can try to find you if you've got a question, and then you can unmute yourself. I'm just looking to see if anybody's. Gosh, they're a quiet lot. Hazel, I see you up in the corner. If you'd like to unmute, you need to unmute, Hazel. We can't hear you.
I thought that was fascinating, and I was so disappointed when you didn't take us to Mongolia and on to Russia. You know,
I can do that as well.
Yes, hopefully for another time. But you know, it looked. I thought that the rural scenes were fantastic, but it is grindingly poor, isn't it? You know, from what I've read, the young people are moving into the towns because of extreme poverty. Was that? I mean, your photographs showed that people were obviously not affluent, but did you get an impression that life was pretty grim for a lot of them?
Well, it's true that there's been a sort of massive movement of people towards the big cities, places like Shenzhen, just across the border from Hong Kong, which 50 years ago was a tiny village and now has about 15 million people or something. And it's true that there are very poor areas. When we were getting the train down from Beijing to Xi'an, we passed by some, I think there were mining areas, and it seemed like everything was just covered by this film of grey dust, and you'd see these shadowy figures on bicycles. But of course, these were not regions that we visited because they're not really very attractive tourist regions. But in those areas, I would imagine there is fairly grinding poverty, but not nearly as much as there would have been 50 years ago. I mean, you have to admire, I mean, whatever we think of the Chinese regime, we have to admire the way that they have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in recent decades. So in the regions that I saw, obviously there was, these weren't the poorest, because when you go to Guangxi and you see these karst cone-shaped mountains, Chinese people like visiting that region. So money kind of filters down, percolates out a bit to the region. Similarly in Danhuang up in the northwest, that is a very popular place for Chinese people to visit. So once again, you're not going to see grinding poverty because they have a tourist industry which generates a bit of money. So I'm sure there is grinding poverty in the rural areas, but not nearly as much as there would have been before. And you're quite right, there's also been an exodus of literally hundreds of millions of people from rural areas into the into the cities. What is striking is, I remember we were in one part of Yunnan, and we saw villagers. Again, they were hill tribe people. It was down in the south of Yunnan, and these two villagers were carrying wood in baskets on their back, and and there was a couple of Chinese tourists there taking photographs of them, and the Chinese tourists were just like us, the same cameras, the same clothes, and they probably came down from Kunming, whereas the villagers with the wood and the baskets on their back, I mean, they could have come from a painting of the Middle Ages. So the contrast really struck me at that particular moment. But against that, these villagers were not living in dire poverty. They were living simple rural lives, but not grinding poverty in that region anyway. Yeah.
Was English widely spoken, Colin?
Not really, no. But the great thing, of course, is Google Translate, which helps you to get by on a basic level. In the regions such as, for example, in Xi'an, where we stayed in a kind of a youth hostel sort of place, they were students. The youth hostel was being run by students who were actually studying English, university students. So English was widely enough spoken for it not to be a problem, but it's really not difficult to travel in China. You know, for example, when we went from Beijing to Xi'an on the fast train, I booked the tickets from Singapore, and then they send you a voucher, which you download, and you can go to any station in China. So when we arrived in Beijing, we went to the railway station, we showed them the voucher on my phone, they printed off our tickets, and off we went. So it's really not difficult. Even if it's somewhere where no one can speak English, you can always find a way of making yourself understood. And if they've got mobile phones, of which most of them do, if it's something simple, you can use Google Translate. And where Google Translate was really great, a real godsend, was on the Trans-Siberian, because otherwise you're going to be stuck for a couple of days, you know, because you stop several times. You don't go right the way through in one go. You stop off in different places. But nonetheless, you might spend a couple of days on the train. And if all you can do is kind of sit next to people, sort of smiling at them, it would be very long. But with Google Translate, you can achieve a decent level of communication. So it's not a problem. There's enough English when you need it. And you know, the place is pretty well organized. There's really no problem traveling in China at all.
Anne, you've got your hand up.
Yes, Colin, that was fantastic. Really brilliant pictures. In relation to what you were talking about before, the country people being more hard up, they have the most beautiful clothes, and I'm wondering how they acquire them. Are they very old?
Okay, right, okay. The people you saw in the photographs, because obviously we were interested in the hill tribes and the Tibetans in that western and southwestern part of China. So, you know, the hill tribes you'll only find in Yunnan and Guangxi, those two southwestern provinces, which border Burma, Thailand, and Laos. I think Vietnam as well on the edge. So those clothes are the traditional clothes that the hill tribe people have been wearing for thousands of years, well, hundreds of years. So you won't, and they know how to make them. Also, sometimes now the colours might be a bit garish because they might use synthetic dyes rather than the traditional plant-based dyes. But there are still communities, perhaps not as many as you might find in northern Burma or northern Thailand or northern Laos, but we were a little surprised to find, you know, quite vibrant hill tribe villages and communities in that southwestern part of China, and they wear different clothes, particularly the women will wear different clothes according to the tribe that they belong to. So that culture is still very much alive. Yeah. But you wouldn't see clothes like that in other parts of China. You see either Western style clothes, or the older people sometimes fairly kind of drab Mao uniform type clothes and that sort of thing. But those colourful clothes were particular to the hill tribes of southwest China.
Thank you, Colin.
Ruth, have you got a question? Did I see your hand up?
Yeah, I've enjoyed seeing all these beautiful photographs. One that I wondered, the photograph with the huge Buddha and on a hillside, and I noticed, did you see if there were caves that had been inhabited at one time on that hillside? It looked as if there was a square one that looked as if it had been used as a home. Did anybody think about that?
Is that the one where there were loads of people, large crowd? Yeah, okay. I don't think there were caves there, because that was in just not far, maybe 50 kilometers or so south of Chengdu, and I don't think there were caves there. No, further north in the northern part of Sichuan province, and in Gansu province in Dunhuang, there were caves there, but I don't think the caves were lived in. They were more places where they were used as places of worship. For example, on the way back from Xi'an to Beijing, there's a whole complex of caves there. The one where you saw my wife in the bottom left-hand corner, where she was so small compared to the statue, there's a whole complex of statues there. And these, but I don't think they were used for being lived in, because if they'd lived in caves, it would have been before that. They were used as places of worship. They built these huge Buddha statues in there. So I don't think they were used as for living, but they were certainly used, because this would have been a couple of thousand years ago. No, those caves were 1,500 years old. They're 1,500 years old. Most people weren't living in, there wouldn't have been people in caves, because China was already quite a sophisticated civilization in those days. But they used them as places of worship, and built these amazing Buddha statues, which, to be fair to the Chinese, they do preserve very well. The other caves were in the northwest of China, up in Gansu province, the next province to the Uyghurs. You keep going west, you get into this Uyghur territory. And those ones, as I said, were decorated, very richly decorated by merchants, who then prayed there before they set off into Central Asia on the Silk Road. But again, they weren't lived in. They were places associated with religious purposes, rather.
Oh, thank you for that. I just wondered when I saw what looked like caves.
Anybody else with a question? Okay. Danny, would you like to, you need to just unmute.
I'd just like to say that was wonderful, Colin. I really enjoyed it. I've always been fascinated by China, and your photographs were great. I've been to China 4 times. I didn't have a camera like yours, though. The first time I went was 1976. Then I went again in the 80s, and the place had changed dramatically. And I always wondered what happened in the countryside when all the people had left, young people had left and gone to the city to work. I went to Chengdu in 76, and it had changed out of all proportion in the 10 years I went back. It seemed like they'd gone through a phase of the industrial and agricultural revolution in 10 or 15 years that took us 100, 200 years to do. And there must have been casualties as a result of all that, but it seemed much wealthier when I went back in the 80s than when I'd first gone. But basically, I don't know if you saw it, in the countryside, one would have thought there would have been some poverty as a result of all young people leaving. But they seem to have, the production of food and clothing and everything else seemed to have improved in the 80s dramatically. It's a much wealthier country now than it was even in the 60s, 70s.
Were you there as a tourist, Danny, or were you there?
I was there as a tourist. It was difficult to get in. And the first time I went, was as a tourist in 1976, and I had to go to Hong Kong to get a visa to go in, because we tried to get a visa through the embassy in London. It took a long time, and there were a lot of hoops to go through, but if we went in through Hong Kong, it was quicker and easier. And I could only get a 3-day trip, but it was fascinating. I'm glad I went, but I didn't see anything like as much as the talk was about. That was a fascinating. You obviously made good use of your school holidays, seeing so much.
We did, for sure. The opportunity was fantastic to be living in Singapore and to have the French school holidays, which I think they've got another 3 or 4 weeks more than we do here in Scotland. So it was a fantastic opportunity, obviously, to travel all over Asia, which we did. You're right that the progress that they've made in terms of industrialization in let's say 50 years, less than 50 years, it took us a couple of 100 years. So you can understand that there might be a bit of turmoil, but they're very industrious and resilient people, and they've got this Confucian idea of respect for authority, and so it helps to kind of galvanize the whole country. I mean, I'd love to have gone when you went in the 1970s. I'd love to have seen that, because of course it was just a different world there completely. But now it's actually very easy to go. I went to the Chinese consulate in Singapore, and you get the visa in a half an hour. You've got your visa, and I can't remember how long the visa was for, but it certainly wasn't for 3 days. It was more like 3 months or even longer. And no one bothers you. Once you're there, you're not bothered at all. You were never ever stopped by the police in us or anything like that. Once you're there, there's no one bothers you whatever. It's very good. But in the 1970s, of course, that would have been absolutely fascinating, because very different place altogether when you were there.
Yeah, people had 2 types of clothes. There was a blue mouse suit or a green mouse suit. I only saw one girl wearing what we see as Western dress in the 3 days I was in Canton or Guangzhou. And the one thing I found intriguing was they showed us they were very proud of the communes, and they told us all about them. They were wonderful. But when I went back some years later, I said, "What happened to the communes?" "Oh, we don't have communes now." I said, "Why not?" "Oh, they didn't work. They told us they were great, fantastic." "No, they told you lies," they said. It was really strange. The whole economic system had changed, but for the better, so there was no problems.
Yeah, they're quite good at that sort of double think. What was true one day so it's not true the next day. They're good at that. They'll say that with a straight face as well. Yeah, the clothes are very interesting, because now a few of the older people still wear their mouse suits, but the weird variety of clothes that they wear now, like those people in the wedding photographs. Yeah, I can't understand what they were. Unfortunately, we couldn't communicate, and it might have been a bit offensive to say to them, "What on earth do you think you're up to?" We were intrigued. And what weird kind of cultural combinations were going on in their heads there. Because you do feel that after the Cultural Revolution, it almost kind of started from year zero again. It's about the only country I've ever been in where you see very few signs of religion. Their only religion these days seems to be materialism, and so that kind of confusion and starting from zero again, and the very fast, overpaced kind of evolution of society, makes the country really fascinating. It really makes it a fascinating place to visit and to travel around.
I know time's getting on, but I think Anne-Marie and then Maggie have had their hands up. If you don't mind 2 more questions, Colin.
No problem at all. Of course not.
Anne-Marie, you need to unmute. Not yet. Shall we go to Maggie?
I should know.
We've got Anne-Marie now.
Got it now,
Well
thank
done,
you.
Anne-Marie.
Sorry about that. That was absolutely fabulous, Colin, amazing. I have a grandson who's trying to learn Mandarin at the moment, so I'm going to give him every encouragement. Anyway, you didn't actually go into Tibet, but you did meet some Tibetan people, is that right? Did you sense any measure of resentment by them towards their Chinese, well, what shall I say, takeover? Did you measure anything at all? Did you sense that there was any resentment towards the Chinese? I wondered about the monks. You saw this. Sorry, are you hearing me?
Yeah. Actually, the person that we spoke most with was the manager or the owner, I think he was, of the guest house where we stayed in the place called the town called Shangri-La, because he had been to India and gone back, so he could speak good English. So he was the person that we got most, had most communication with. And when he took us on that walk, the day walk, to visit the Tibetan village and the farm and everything, there we were able to talk. Otherwise, communication was a bit difficult.
Right.
And there was resentment, certainly. I mean, he expressed resentment, but also a degree, I think, of resignation.
Yes, they seem so passive.
Yeah. Well, passive, I mean, they're not entirely passive. I mean, from time to time, monks set themselves on fire, protest. And there was in Western Sichuan, so just on the edge of Tibet, there was a very big, which had grown sort of like a mushroom almost out of nothing, a very big Tibetan spiritual center, where we wanted to go, but unfortunately the Chinese closed it down before we got there. And they used the usual sort of excuse of they had to improve the infrastructure and stuff like that, you know, the drainage and everything like that. But what really happened was that the Chinese thought it was getting a bit too big, so they just closed it down with some sort of stupid excuse about drainage. So it wouldn't be true to say they're entirely passive. But of course, I mean, what are they supposed to do against the might of the Chinese state, and also the ruthlessness of the Chinese state? I mean, more recently, we've seen how the Chinese have treated the Uyghurs, and the Chinese have been in some sort of slow cultural genocide towards the Tibetans ever since the early 1950s.
Well, they're going to take us all over the way they're going. Anyway, thanks very much. That was fabulous. Thank you.
You could actually argue that it's remarkable the extent to which Tibetan culture has survived.
Still existing, yes.
We were very pleased to see it.
Very sad, very sad.
But we were pleased to see the degree to which it has actually survived. In particular, survived the Cultural Revolution, which was a terrible time of violence and upheaval.
What a way to have to put up with things. Thanks very much, tremendous.
Maggie, do you want to ask your question? Maggie? Yeah.
Yes, Colin, your photographs were extraordinary, showing the vastness of China and the different types of culture that exist in different regions and over more than one visit. When you were talking about the kind of doublethink, for example, that Shangri-La that you were just talking about, where the original Tibetan name has been basically erased to Shangri-La to attract tourists, where I thought your photograph of the huge surreal bowl of artificial flowers was in Tiananmen Square. That was in Tiananmen Square. That seemed to be extraordinary irony and a very valuable photograph for that, because the history of what actually happened in Tiananmen Square has also been erased, you know, to the point of, you know, people will be arrested and find themselves in a whole lot of trouble if they even start to talk about it. And also the juxtaposition with the Buddha, you were saying, and I noticed in the photograph, and you drew our attention to the fact that, you know, just over the valley, there's this huge concrete high rise going on for miles and miles. And there are so many kind of slightly queasy contradictions going on. I wonder if you could expand on that in any way, or what your own impression is, you know, knowing the place and having visited it.
Well, the Chinese, I don't think, would see a contradiction between that giant seated Buddha and all the high rises just on the other side of the
Sorry,
river.
a juxtaposition is what I said, not a
Yeah,
contrast.
they would see it, this one as a historical monument, which they're happy to visit, and the other represents modernity. So for them, you know, for them, industrialization and large cities and tower blocks represent progress, and the monuments represent history, and it's incredible what they can achieve. You know, they would build a metro system with half a dozen lines for a city the size of Glasgow in a year. And once they put their minds to something, it's just extraordinary what they can achieve, both in terms of planning and discipline and sheer hard work. It's quite extraordinary they can achieve. So we might think it's a pity how some of the older monuments have disappeared or traditional life has disappeared, but they see that as a very good step in improving the standard of living of the majority of the people. And in fact, when they talk about human rights, their argument always is that you should see human rights in terms of people's living standards, and that they have in fact done very well in terms of human rights because they've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty. That's their kind of point of view. So they wouldn't see any kind of conflict there, I don't think. They would see everything that's happening as something to be proud of. All the kind of the great leap forward in terms of modernity and industrialization and new buildings. They would see that as something fantastic, you know, something that the country can be proud of.
That's interesting.
Colin, I think we could keep you here for another hour, but we better not. Thank you so much on behalf of everyone. I mean, I think I'm speaking for everyone when I say that was a really fascinating talk. And hearing that you might have other presentations on your other travels, I think we'll definitely be in touch with you again about that, because that would just be amazing. So I'd just like to thank you in the usual way for giving up your time today. It's most enjoyable. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure, and I enjoyed the talk. Mongolia was a very fascinating place. That's an amazing place as well.
I think the thing is, there are places that most of us haven't visited, so you know, it's great to hear your impressions of them. Next month, as we mentioned earlier, it looks like we're on Zoom again, and then hopefully in March we'll be back in the hall, all being well. But we'll give you full details in the newsletter in a couple of weeks' time. So thank you all very much for coming along this morning, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.